Part 1. The beginning of all things to end. Chapter 1. Monday, 8 a.m. Brain, online. Conscious awareness, 100%. Emotional turmoil, 200% and climbing. Press any button to continue. John awoke in the chair, not even registering that he hadn't made it into his bed the previous night. Truthfully, having no memory of falling asleep at all. But it had been so very many years since he had enjoyed any kind of regular sleep pattern that this was nothing new. Insomnia had been the bane of over 3/4 of his life. He used to joke that he was born to be awake. Although he had wished for sleep quietly to himself, that eternal sleep, to close your eyes one last time and sleep forevermore. But now it was different. He had no interest in sleep now. Too many things to do to be sleeping. This is going to take some serious time and planning, he thought to himself as he turned on his laptop and made his first coffee for the day. He always said it was a good idea to have a kettle in his games room, but now he finally had an example to prove it. She wasn't there to share it with. The irony wasn't wasted on him. He looked at the table, and in his mind's eye he saw the note, stood innocuously in the middle, not giving a clue as to the pain it had held within. But not anymore. There was no pain now, just resolution and retribution, as cold as ice and as immovable as a mountain. The first thing he checked was his online bank account, and while not at all surprised, he still smiled when the balance confirmed that she had been as good as her word. There was a little over £4,000 in the account. Nowhere near enough, he said aloud to nobody. He let his gaze wander around the room and knew then that he would sell this house. She had no claim on this house. It had been in his family for more than 5 generations, and with no siblings, he was the last in the line. In the current climate, I'd get around 800,000 for this place, he thought. He smiled inwardly. That ought to cover it, he said aloud again, to nobody. His attention turned to the television set. Once it had been his absolute prized possession. Now it looked quite forlorn with a gaming console embedded in its screen. He carefully extricated the console and plugged it up. Much to his surprise, and despite the trauma it had suffered on the previous day, it appeared to be working. Good, he thought to himself, only the telly to replace. Oh yeah, and another controller. He thought about the trip to the game shop 2 days running and decided he would go elsewhere for the controller, convinced that if he went back to the same shop they would ridicule him, or worse still, they may see something dangerous in him and suspect something. No, that's just stupid paranoia, but they will take the piss for certain, he thought. He went back to his laptop and found a number for his nearest Comet store, called them and ordered his new telly, and just in case his assumptions were wrong regarding his current console, he also ordered a new PS3. It comes with a controller as well, he thought as he paid for his purchase, opting to pay the extra for same-day delivery and receiving assurances that his purchases would be with him by 2 o'clock. He thanked the disembodied voice and hung up the phone. Right, that's you sorted, he said to the broken telly as he moved it to the other side of the room, making space for the new one to go straight in. I need to select my targets carefully, he thought aloud, and wandered over to the shelves that housed his collection of games. It was a sight to see. Over 1,000 games in many different formats, all in original condition, all with the consoles they were written for. He never played the old games anymore. He didn't even set up any of the old consoles, but he knew that if he wanted to, he could. "Now then," he said, "which of you fuckers are the worst offenders?" The rest of the day was lost in an unending catalogue of games and making lists and taking notes, barely even registering the arrival of his earlier purchases, merely putting them to one side and continuing with the task at hand. With no concept of time passing other than daylight turning to darkness, he sifted through page after page of notes and comments, eventually narrowing down the list to 3 companies. He went back to the laptop to continue his research. It turned out that one was based in Japan, while the other 2 were located in the continental United States. He quickly discounted the concept of Japan. He didn't like the thought of all those Yakuza and samurai that he believed they had. And besides, he didn't speak a word of Japanese and would stand out like a noob at a gaming tournament. Equally, America should be easier. What was it they said? Same language, smaller IQ? He said out loud and giggled a little. He continued narrowing the geographical field and could not believe what he found. "Oh, you motherfuckers," he exclaimed. "Why did I not see that one coming?" As he read further, he discovered that not only were they sibling companies, but they occupied 25 floors each of a 50-story office building. "I should have guessed," he said. "All in it together like one big fucking-spiracy." Well, now he knew. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he needed to learn. Now it was just a matter of time and money, both of which he would manage and arrange with what he considered to be military precision. After all, he'd had years of experience with military tactics. That is to say, in the world of gaming, he'd had years of experience with military tactics. "It's all the same," he said. "They'll never see me coming." The coming months were to be a blur of red tape and paperwork, of packing and downsizing. 6 months later. It had taken just over 4 months to fully complete the sale of the house, and ultimately he had fetched a better price than he had originally thought. During this time he had started planning in depth and detail. He had obtained copies of the original blueprints for the building from the architect himself, and that had been easier than he thought it would be. He had posed as a mature student studying American architecture and had played to the man's ego. "These Yanks are just too fucking easy," he thought to himself. "A double-shot 100-proof lip service and they do whatever you ask." He had even managed to procure a complete schematic for all of the building's power and safety from a disgruntled former employee who had apparently fallen from grace by arguing game ethics for the end user. A man after his own heart, it would seem. It had covered everything he needed to know, from primary power to backup emergency power, from fire alarms to sprinkler systems, and all relevant plumbing and distribution information. Slowly but surely, all the pieces were falling into place, like the world's biggest jigsaw. He had exploited the internet to the absolute limit of his abilities to study explosives and demolition. He had learned about all sorts of different kinds of detonation, from homemade to industrial and all points in between. What types were best for what jobs? Big blast, small blast, fire, no fire. He knew it all now. He had even found an outlet that would provide the necessary equipment for remote detonation. "Oh, you've got to love the destructive nature of people," he thought to himself, as he read still more information on how to level a building. And nobody destroys shit quite like the Americans. His research into firearms had educated him far more than he first thought it would, and he was amazed at just how easy they were to procure legally. His shopping list was quite extensive, but he had found outlets online that between them would supply everything he needed with no problems whatsoever. Extensive research had informed him that his best bet for both convenience and anonymity would be to set up his operational base in Texas. Deep in the heart of redneck Nowhereville, he thought to himself. He spent a few days looking through the thousands of rental properties that were available to him in the Lone Star State before finding what he considered to be the ideal place. It was described as a small family residence with some attached outbuildings and a small amount of land. In fact, it was a 5-bedroom wooden farmhouse with 80 acres that it sat in the middle of. He'd spoken to the company in charge of letting and explained to them that he was coming over on a 2-year working visa and that he was happy to pay the full amount of rent to cover the entirety of his stay. They couldn't take his money quick enough. They assured him that he would not regret his decision to come stateside, certain in their own mind that he would want to stay and never leave their wonderful country and state. In his mind, he ran through the route of his plans and agreed that they may well be right, adding quietly to himself that he knew how this would end. And they were probably right. Once there, he would never leave the United States of America again. The internet was a black market of information if you knew where to look, and he had managed to procure for a price a network login for each company, but had not had the courage to actually test them yet for fear of being discovered. He would test them once he was there. It wouldn't look unusual gaining access remotely there, certainly not as unusual as gaining access from another country. They mustn't see me coming, he said. He was due to fly out in 10 days from now, and for the first time in months he found himself with time on his hands. It felt good to be this organised, but he was unsure of what to do for the next 10 days. He looked to his console and said no out loud, as if reprimanding a small child. The rage needed to be kept at bay. He dare not risk an outburst of temper, or worse. He couldn't risk talking to any of his gaming friends in case he let something slip. Now, more so than ever, it was imperative that he stayed off the radar. His exit from the UK needed to be completely unnoticed by the world. He was afraid that if they saw what was behind his eyes, they would treat him like a terrorist. He wasn't a terrorist, no sir, not even similar. Terrorists kill the innocent with no conscience, and then they hide behind religion. But not him. He was going after the guilty, and he already knew there was no God. Terrorists openly hate America, whereas he did not. The place had fascinated him for years. He was a teacher, a bringer of knowledge, and it was his calling to teach those that needed to be taught. Instead, he watched films, lots of films, carefully writing down all the clever little speeches and witty put-downs and one-liners, cataloguing meticulously for potential future use. 10 days just flew by. Leaving day. After the house sale had gone through, his bank balance rose to just over £950,000. More than enough to realise all of his plans right up to the last level. He had given away most of his household items to various friends and associates, along with a well-rehearsed story about emigrating to America to take up a job offer to join a creative team developing storylines for video games, as well as having to explain about mains voltage differences and casually dropping into the story the price he had got for the house. People are so easy to deceive. Just tell them something to make them green with envy, and they swallow it all up. Then give them something for free, and they will thank you for making them feel inferior. The last big giveaway was by far the most difficult. His lifelong collection of all things gaming, more than 30 years of his life. But he had already decided who he would pass it all on to. Oddly, somebody he had never met in person. His longest standing online gamer friend. John knew him as Monterey_Jack. He'd wanted a cheesy name. Poor humour he knew, but that's how real gamers think. Like the Metallica lyrics say, you know it's sad but true. He smiled at his own weak humour. Despite 15 years of gaming friendship, it still took a week of emailing to get a postal address for him, with the promise of a surprise he would never forget. Still, it was done now. The delivery firm had collected all 14 boxes yesterday, and if his day ran to schedule, Monterey Jack would be receiving his surprise right around takeoff time. No going back now. It was just him, his money, and the clothes he stood up in. A car horn honked 3 times outside the bedsitter he had rented for the last 6 weeks. He looked out of the window and saw it was the taxi he had booked to get him to the airport. He caught the driver's attention and signalled that he would be 2 minutes. The driver gave a thumbs up by way of response. One last set of ties to sever. He went to the bathroom and flushed away both his mobile phone and the hard drive from his laptop. No trail to follow, less risk of discovery. One can't be too careful. He locked the door and deposited the key through the landlord's letterbox. He got into the taxi and said, "Heathrow, please, Terminal 3. He looked at his watch and saw he had over an hour till check-in, and it was a 40-ish minute drive, so he got comfortable and feigned dozing off, always aware of his immediate surroundings and choosing to ignore the cabbie's attempts at conversation. Check-in was completely uneventful. His total lack of luggage raised an eyebrow or two, but it was no big deal. He was happy to explain all about his new life and his financial security, and everybody wished him luck with his great adventure. Now, strapped into his seat, he prepared for takeoff. Surprised at his lack of nerves, considering this was in fact his first flight. Equally, the flight itself was completely uneventful, and he slept through most of it, waking only for a toilet break and when they served dinner. Before he knew it, they were approaching Dallas International Airport. He had arrived safe and sound. Clearing customs was again uneventful, and he was repeatedly told, "Welcome to the United States of America. Enjoy your stay." If they only knew, he thought quietly to himself. But he nodded and smiled in all the right places and answered all of their questions confidently and politely. Now he found himself outside the